The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of ParaX, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Step outside of your comfort zone. See the world with a whole new perspective. Join us and experience the unexplained on the Paranormal View.
And welcome everybody right here to the Paranormal View on the ParaX Radio Network. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight, those here in the chat room and those listening from around the world. We appreciate each and every one. So if you have questions tonight, you can private chat them to either myself, Ceiling Cat, and I guess we're the only two that's in there right now. And we will get those answered for you just as soon as we can. And if you're listening from somewhere else around the world, you can feel free to come over here to ParaX Radio Network and click right on the instructions to follow to get into the chat room here. And if you have questions but you don't want to come to the chat room, you can still send them to theparanormalview@gmail.com and we will get those answered. So tonight we have with us Barbara Duncan.
Greetings, everyone.
And we have Jeffrey Gould.
Hello, hello.
And we have another great guest. He's been on a few times, so everybody likes him. He has some great books out. And we're going to let Jeff introduce our guest.
Yes, well, tonight's returning guest is Keven McQueen. He's born in Richmond, Kentucky. He's an instructor in the Department of English and Theater at Easterm Kentucky University and is the author of several books covering such topics as history, biography, historical true crime, natural disasters, folklore, and ghostlore. So welcome back, Keven McQueen.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
And I hope you're doing well.
I am doing well.
All right. Tonight, your book, the one we're going to be talking about, is called Bizarre Bluegrass. And that means most of everything in there is about Kentucky or affiliated with Kentucky.
Not about the music genre.
Not about the music.
Yeah, it didn't occur to me till later. Someone might think it was about bluegrass music, but really it isn't.
No, it's not.
Wasn't bluegrass music kind of bizarre in its own right? So, it kind of works out.
In a way.
Yeah, in a way. This book here has a lot of good stuff in there. And usually it talks about different topics in there. And a lot of it's different counties and stuff associated with the book in Kentucky. And you have a lot in there about Lincoln. In case people didn't know, Lincoln was born in Kentucky. And,
yes, he was.
And you have a lot of different stories related to Lincoln, pretty much started in the book. And one of the ones that I kind of liked right to start with was before he became president, he was a lawyer. And one of the first stories you have about him in there is called Proving a Point, and that's on page 9.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay.
Thanks for giving me the page number.
I learned to
really
do that.
Spending a lot of time thumbing through here looking.
It's an interesting fact what he did when he was a lawyer in a courtroom.
Yeah, he was in court. They were suing over a will. The rival attorneys was trying to prove that it was a genuine will. Lincoln was trying to prove that it was not a genuine will. So the rival attorney spent hours and hours providing evidence that the will was genuine. Lincoln only had one witness to put on the stand, whereupon the witness was actually a retired paper manufacturer, and Lincoln said, hold the paper up to the light and tell us what the watermark is on it. And the man answered, it's my watermark from my firm. And Lincoln asked, when did your firm begin to manufacture paper? Answer, 1841. And Lincoln, what's the date on the document? August 11th, 1836. And then Lincoln said, well, the case is closed.
Except Lincoln didn't realize he had just proven time travel, but other than that.
He turns up in a lot of time travel stories for some reason.
Yeah.
And killing vampires. But
Yeah.
that's another story.
Too. But that, of course, is real. He really did that.
You had to wield that axe, I'll tell you.
Yeah, well, I mean, because that's going to a lot of myth, which was that Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Illinois, and obviously that's not the case. When did he move to Illinois?
Well, he was a little boy. The family actually moved to Indiana first and lived there quite a few years, I think. I'm not sure off the top of my head when he went to Illinois, but he was a young man by then and became an attorney and lived in Springfield.
Okay. Didn't he work for the post office as well?
I think maybe he did.
Yeah.
He had a lot of jobs.
Yeah. And he became a lawyer later in life then, obviously.
Later in life, I think in his, his late 20s, perhaps, his 30s.
Okay. Because given the time period and the educational system, that's quite a remarkable feat itself.
It really is.
A smart person.
Now, there was...
What
Go ahead, Barbara. I'm sorry.
What about his parents and their background? Because I briefly remember studying Lincoln, but not that much. And there really isn't a lot going on about his parents.
His father was a frontiersman and a furniture maker, and apparently they didn't get along very well, Lincoln and his father, Thomas Lincoln. Lincoln's mother died when he was, I think, 8 years old. Her name was Nancy Hanks. And then Thomas Lincoln married again, and Lincoln had a stepmother, I'm sorry, for the rest of his childhood.
So, is Tom Hanks related to? No, I thought I read somewhere that he was, but I couldn't.
Oh, that's possible.
Well, he might be. It's entirely possible.
Huh. Good question, though.
It's said in my family that we're a distant relative to Alexander Graham Bell, but we still got phone bills.
You still got phone bills.
I don't think you get residuals, Jeff.
No. Well, that's on my mother's side. So.
You know, early in the Civil War, they had a thing where if you had money and you were, I guess, drafted, you could pay somebody to take your place in the draft and go serve for you. Lincoln.
Apparently it.
Well, Lincoln did that. There was, I guess, he didn't want to actually, I guess, not go just because he was president. So he did get a substitute, right?
Yeah, I think he was probably exempt because he was president. Plus, at the time, he would have been something like 54 years old. But just to set an example, he actually paid a substitute to fight in his place.
Wow. That is odd.
Plus, he would have stood out in a crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah, shoot that tall guy.
And I guess he made it all the way through the war too, right?
Yeah, he died in 1888. His name was Staples, John Staples of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania.
Wow. Oh, and folks, for the record, yes, he was. Tom Hanks was related to Nancy Hanks 4 times removed.
Huh.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Wow.
Well, The show is all about, knowledge and
It's
acquirement.
educational
Yes.
and entertaining. We all just learned something.
Well, you had a lot about the president and a lot about when he was in office. You got a story in here about there used to be a group of Confederates called Mosby's Rangers, and there was a article in there about Mosby's taunt to Lincoln because he made some sort of a statement, right?
Yes, he did. He was the leader of the Mosby's Rangers, Confederate guerrillas. And, of course, Washington, D.C. is in the South, and it was constantly in danger of being invaded. In fact, I've been doing research in newspapers just very recently from 1861 and found that Beauregard, I believe it was, he came so close to Washington, D.C. that they almost had to evacuate all the women and children.
Wow.
But, Colonel Mosby, in 1861, he was on the Virginia side of the river, so very close to Washington, D.C., and he saw an elderly lady who sold vegetables. And just to make fun of Lincoln, he borrowed a pair of scissors and cut off a lock of hair and handed it to the vegetable seller and said, "Take this to Lincoln and tell him Mosby will be over in a few days to take a lock of his hair." Well, he rode away and forgot about his little joke, and a few months later he was back in the area. And the elderly lady ran out of her house and handed him an envelope and said, "Colonel Mosby, President Lincoln told me to give you this and would rather send it to you rather than put you through the trouble of coming after it." And in the envelope was a lock of Lincoln's hair.
When you do research on these stories, how do you find little tidbits and stuff like that?
Well, Lincoln is probably the most written about person in American history, but it's surprising all the little things you can find if you go through the old newspapers. You'll find little bits and pieces and anecdotes that somehow never made it into other books.
Huh.
So here's a collection of little stories that I found in the old newspapers that I hadn't seen anywhere else. He almost fought a duel. That's somewhat well known, but it was strange enough that I put it in the book anyway.
And how do you get out of that?
But
Very diplomatically, it seems. He just, the other person backed down.
Wasn't John Wilkes Booth, I guess.
It came close enough that they picked out a spot where they were going to go.
Huh.
wow. That was fairly common for the day, correct?
Yes, it was. In fact, in the course of my research, I found that he almost got in a second duel,
Wow.
Wow.
which was even less well known than the first one.
Well, good thing he wasn't hanging around Andrew Jackson. That guy loved having duels right and left.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he had bullet wounds, actually, till the day he died.
That's weird. I mean, when you stop and think about, it was mostly an honor system, I guess, somewhat insulting. So, what was the circumstances behind Lincoln's duel? Was it an insult, or was it more of a matter of political honor?
More of an insult. The first duel, it never really came to pass, but it almost did. It was in 1842, by which time Lincoln was living in Illinois, and the state auditor was named James Shields. And in the local paper, there were these anonymous articles making fun of Mr. Shields, allegedly written by a lady called Aunt Rebecca. And somehow Shields got the word that Lincoln wrote the letters under a pseudonym and threatened with the duel. And they were going to fight with swords. And allegedly Shields backed down when he realized that Lincoln had such long arms that he could probably make mincemeat of him in a sword fight.
Well, I guess they still did fight with swords in the day. I thought it was mostly guns at 20 paces or whatever the
Usually
I think
so, but the
think
person who
swords
was
are 24
challenged was allowed to choose his own weapon.
Okay.
So I've written a lot about duels. I have one book called Strange, well, it's got a title that even I can never remember, Gothic and Strange True Tales of the South. And there's a whole chapter on weird duels that took place in the South in the 19th century. It staggers the imagination to see the things people actually fought with.
Are you referring to Gothic Tale and Strange Tales?
That might be it. It's Gothic and Strange Tales of the South. It's
Ah,
Gothic,
yeah.
Strange Tales South in some order like that, but I never remember the proper order.
That's okay. That's why you've got a badger.
Yeah, I think it's Gothic and Strange.
Yep. Gothic and Strange Two Tales of the South.
Oh, that's it.
Yep. I have your
There
books all
you find
listed,
it.
so don't mind.
Accounts of people fighting with everything from grave digging tools to axes to tobacco sticks. And of course, pistols.
Or ducks at 20 paces.
And ducks at 20 paces. Don't give them any ideas. I'm sure they would have.
Well, you have a story in there that, excuse me, he was famous for a battle that he did in Gettysburg, and it was called Pickett's Charge. But your story in here is his old friend Abe Lincoln, and it talks about George Pickett because they were friends. That's on page 16.
Pretty interesting story. It was in 1865, after Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital fell. Lincoln went there to just sort of look around and inspect the city, and George Pickett lived there, the general, Confederate general. And Lincoln went to the door and knocked on it, and Mrs. Pickett answered. Lincoln said, "Does George Pickett live here?" And she said, "General Pickett lives here, sir, but he's not at home. He's with the army under General Lee." And so Lincoln simply said, "Well, will you please tell him when he returns, his old friend Abraham Lincoln called to see him." And Mrs. Pickett later said she gained a whole new respect for Lincoln after that.
Now, did they meet up again after the war?
I don't think they did. I don't think so. I don't think there was time, because Lincoln would have been shot soon afterward.
Right. That's true.
And one of the interesting things is that Pickett used to be a military officer at West Point. And he was about to get kicked out, and his family hired Lincoln to help keep him in. So Lincoln actually unwittingly saved the military career of a general who would later be one of his enemies.
Rather irony.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, history's full of little ironies like that. I love that stuff. You could do a whole book on those. Oh, I'll tell you a good one that's not in the book because I didn't know it until after the book was finished. So someday I'll put it in a book. As we all know, Lincoln was killed at the Ford's Theater during the play Our American Cousin.
Right.
Which was, the rights to the play were owned by an English actress named Laura Keene. And the same way people pirate videos and things like that today, in those days, pirates would take a copyrighted play and they'd go on the road and do the play in other cities. And she caught wind of it, that John T. Ford was doing an unauthorized production of Our American Cousin. And this would have been something like 1858. Long before the Civil War, long before Lincoln was killed, and she actually sued him. Basically saying, you cannot show Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater unless I'm in it. And then, of course, she got her wish a few years later, and it turned out to be the most notorious play in American history.
Well, at least the most production, certainly the worst production.
Yeah, the worst production.
Definitely didn't get a standing ovation, that's for sure. Plus, you had an actor talk about break a leg. I mean,
That's funny. You had a bunch of, I guess, chapters were named kind of funny, but on page, hold on here, 53, you have what's called the Blue Goon of Kentucky, and not Blue Moon, but Blue Goon.
Oh, I wondered if anyone would get it, so I'm glad one person got it.
I did.
Look for the puns. There are always little puns being hidden here and there and pop culture references.
And it wasn't the Blue Lagoon either, I guess.
No, that would have been actually kind of nice to see. What this story was about was in the early 20s, a certain area of Louisville, Kentucky was in a panic because people kept seeing or kept thinking they saw a very tall man with blue skin peeping in their windows.
And he
Just peeping in?
Peeping in, several people fired at him point blank, and it didn't seem to do him any harm.
Probably didn't do the window much good either.
No, probably not.
How
It's a very
odd.
strange story. So it seems to be a mixture of a lot of things, from practical jokes to hoaxes to outright lies, maybe. But you always have to wonder, what was the very first thing that happened that got the whole thing rolling? And then one day, no one saw him again.
He just
Well, he went
just disappeared.
to Vegas and formed the Blue Man Group.
That's where they got it from.
Yeah.
Or went off to fight the English in Scotland, too. That's another
He
story.
became a pig.
Well, that would have been pretty as a pick.
Pickett's charge. We won't go there. We will not go down the pun road.
Yes. We will be brave.
Celtics and,
We will try not to do that.
It's going to happen, though. We know it.
Yeah, before the night's over, there will be more.
probably
We can't help it.
on page 59. I thought this here was a pretty interesting story, and you'll have to tell all about it. It was called Some Mother's Boy.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty recent one, too. Usually I avoid really recent stories. I try to stick to things that happened pretty much before 1940 is my cutoff point. But this one, it was in 1921. A
Yes.
young man, a teenager, actually was hit by a train in Georgetown, Kentucky. And no one could figure out who he was. He had some identifying marks on his clothes, but none of them helped. And they put out ads, and I think they did a radio campaign and newspapers, and they got a lot of inquiries from around the country, but nobody knew who the boy was. So he got buried in an anonymous grave in Georgetown, and they wrote Some Mother's Boy on the tombstone. And there he lay unidentified for decades and decades and decades. But in 2016, the local coroner, who had a long-standing interest in the case, did a little research, and he thought he figured it out. He noticed that a 19-year-old boy named Frank Haynes disappeared from his home in Pulaski County just a few days before the boy was killed in Georgetown. And he discovered that Frank Haynes had some surviving relatives, including a couple of nieces. And they actually exhumed the grave in 2017 and compared the DNA in the grave to the surviving nieces, and it turned out that it was completely true. The boy called Some Mother's Son was actually Frank Haynes.
Well, that's pretty
That's
interesting.
amazing that they did that.
Did they
So this, I'm sorry.
did they put his name in on the tombstone?
They actually exhumed him and buried him back in Pulaski County in a family grave.
Ah,
So there's a missing persons case that was solved almost 100 years after it happened, 96 years.
pretty interesting like that.
It's often and very interesting that some of the gravestones and the inscriptions on there. That's an interesting one for me.
Yeah, for decades and decades, it just said Some Mother's Son.
Yeah.
There's a 19th century gravestone that simply says the doctor, and like a subtitle it says he helps people, and people have memed that saying this is much more disturbing than you realize because, Doctor Who fans, that somebody would only be called the doctor, didn't have a name enough to put on the tombstone.
Wow, that's weird. It's time
Then you
travel.
never know. Well, yeah, but also you never know. I mean, I assume maybe they assumed that everybody would know who it was, and not think after 200 years that it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting. So, when you go looking for stories, say around Kentucky, I'm sure that you just hit all the newspapers and articles and stuff.
Almost all of it comes from old newspapers. I just spent years and years going through old papers, issue by issue, and taking track of good stories.
And then you store it until you get ready to put it in a book.
Yeah, that's it. Then if I decide I want to do a Kentucky book, I just go through there looking for Kentucky stories. And it's just a matter then of going to the library and making copies of those pages.
And I guess you
Now-
do. Go ahead, Barbara.
How hard is it to find some of these newspapers? I'm looking at some of the 1918 flu epidemics around the San Francisco area, and the papers are in the archives and online, but some of them are so difficult to read. I can't imagine how much time and painstaking research you're doing, because some of this cannot be easy to read.
It's murder. It really is. It's I have to wear glasses, magnifying glasses, because in the 19th century papers I'm looking at now, the type is tiny. Huge pages, 9 columns across, and tiny type.
And probably photographed somehow to get them onto digital format. It's difficult.
Yeah, I actually still use microfilm.
Really?
So that's how far behind the times I am. I just like it better than I do digital film. I like digital newspapers. If you know what you're looking for, if you have a name or something, they're extremely handy. But most of what I find is just total accident. And the only real way to do that is to go through microfilm.
So when you go through these articles, do you start researching topics, and is that how you do your research? Like, I want to find out all duels that were fought within a certain time frame, or do you just go through newspapers and start pulling out interesting stories?
It's pretty much the reverse. Instead of looking for something specific, I just go through it issue by issue with a laptop, and if there's a duel story, then I'll make a very short synopsis with a date and a page number. So then later, if I want to do something on duels, all I have to do is go back and look for them. So generally, the information comes before I decide to write anything.
Okay.
But sometimes there are big events in history, and I know the date, and I'm specifically looking for those as I go along.
So when you started researching or coming across all the Lincoln stories, was this a planned event that you wanted to do something, and that's how you were doing the searches on the stuff? Because some of this is like, wow.
It wasn't really planned. I just went through the papers, and if I found a Lincoln story that was good that wasn't really well known, I just made a note of it, the date and the page number, and then when the day came that I wanted to do some Lincoln stories, I already had them pretty much found. I just had to go copy the pages.
And your intention of putting them in the Kentucky book was because that was his birthplace?
Yes, I
Okay.
just wanted Kentucky stories. I hadn't done an all Kentucky book in several years, about 8 years, and I thought it was time to do one.
There's certainly a lot of interesting stuff coming out of Kentucky. And some of it more modern, but also isn't that, we talked before about the Hopkinsville goblins and all sorts of folklore and cryptid stories that come out of Kentucky, simply because of the cave system that's down there, right?
Very well could be. I did a lot of cryptids. One of my older books is called Forgotten Tales of Kentucky. And there's a chapter in there all about monsters and sea creatures. Well, not sea creatures, but lake creatures from Kentucky.
Which one wouldn't think there would be, but
No, you wouldn't think so, but I was surprised at how many there were.
is this just stories that is being told back, passed down to generation, or are there actual news stories?
Oh, these are news stories.
Wow.
Yeah, there are some people who specialize in folklore and stories that are passed down generation to generation. But I like to get things that are from newspapers, because there you can get really specific details and names and dates and places.
Now, do you think that the newspapers, it's hard to identify and certify that all these stories are true, but you would think that some of the newspaper reporters back then were as ethical as they are today and coming up with the news stories and trying to track down all the right facts, etc.?
Well, that's always a problem. They're very good stories, but the thing to keep in mind is that often there are no follow-up stories. So you don't know what really, really happened. You just have the version of it in the papers. And, again, not to bring up time travel yet again, apparently that's an obsession there, but short of building a time machine and going back to that time and place, you don't really know what these people really saw. It might have been something perfectly natural, but it might have been something supernatural. You just have no way of knowing. The stories that I really like, some of them are just one-shot stories that are really bizarre and really funny, but sometimes it'll go on for a few weeks. And more people see like the Blue Man story. And that's when things get really interesting, because it isn't just one guy seeing something in one place at one time. It becomes a community of people seeing something.
Yeah, wow. He hit different places in the town like that.
Yeah, basically in one neighborhood, but then he started branching out a little. Again, you read it and you think, well, some of these are undoubtedly practical jokes or hoaxes, but some of them are a little harder to explain. Like when he would be shot at point blank range and not die.
And what did he dye himself blue with?
You have to wonder.
Yeah.
If he was dyed.
He could have had some sort of a skin-tight clothing on that was blue or something.
I don't think they had spandex back
then. Maybe they had blue face paint in the 20s. I'm not really sure. Obviously, we have it now.
Yeah.
Well, you gotta.
But it's also the idea that I guess you could follow up on murder stories with the court dates and the trials, etc., right?
Yeah, that's definitely true, especially for a newspaper story. If you find a good, interesting murder story, you can always get court records. Mostly I use the Louisville Courier-Journal, which was a very respectable paper. Sometimes they got hoaxed, but whenever they did, they generally run a story a few days later where they'd say, well, that story wasn't true. We got hoaxed, and then I know it wasn't true.
Oh, interesting.
So, don't they tend to pronounce that Louisville?
It depends, and I think I've heard it pronounced 3 or 4 different ways.
Usually I hear from people from Kentucky, and they're very particular that it's pronounced Louisville.
A lot of people call Louisville, or I've heard people call it Level.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's like New Orleans. There's like 5 ways of saying
New Orleans.
it.
New Orleans. Gotta say New Orleans.
New Orleans, New Orleans, New Orleans, New Orleans.
Well, you got.
I can never say it twice the same way myself.
You got a story on page 62 that was really interesting, and this took place in Cincinnati and over into northern Kentucky. And
yes,
it's called Pearl's Head.
It's actually one of the most famous murder stories in Kentucky and Ohio history. It's about Pearl Bryan. And the case is so famous, entire books have been written about it. I think there are websites devoted to it. She was from Indiana, Greencastle, Indiana. And she was in her late teens. And she became pregnant out of wedlock by a visitor to town. and she insisted that he marry her. He ran off to dental school in Cincinnati to get away from her, but she followed him there. So he and his fairly slow-witted roommate tried to talk her into having an abortion. That didn't work. So they sailed across the river to Kentucky, to Fort Thomas, and they killed her in Fort Thomas on someone's farm. And it's the kind of murder that's taken place hundreds of times. What made it really interesting, what made it stand out, what made it memorable is that the murderers cut off her head while she was still alive. That's the detail that really made it immortal. And then the head was never found. The body itself was identified fairly quickly from her shoes, but the head was never discovered, and it's been speculated decades and decades afterward what happened to Pearl's head. So in the book, I had a couple of possibilities in which I found, again, going through old newspapers, a couple of long-forgotten stories about people finding solitary female skulls in that particular area. And neither was positively identified as being Pearl's, but in either case, it could have been hers. It was female. It was a small female. One had gold fillings. She had gold fillings. The papers never followed up on that to say if her dentist ever identified it as being her head. But anyway, it's two possibilities.
And
Like they were working on starting their own ossuary or something.
Yeah.
Well, the head kept being lost, didn't it? And then turn up somewhere else, or somebody'd find another head.
Well, it was two different heads found in two different places, close to where the murder took place, in 2 separate years. The usual theory is that they took the head back to the dental college and burned it in the furnace. That's usually what people think occurred. It might have happened. I have a few reasons in the book why it possibly may not have happened that way.
Probably because they didn't have any crematoriums at a dental school, or...
Well, a body's not an easy thing to burn, and especially a head, because the skull has got such thick bones to it. You almost have to break it up with a hammer or something, and it requires extremely high temperatures, far more than, say, a school furnace would put out. So possibly they put her head there, but just somehow it doesn't seem likely.
That would be an interesting way to label it, though. School skull furnace.
Yeah, the school skull furnace.
That sounds suspiciously like, wasn't that kind of like the murder that supposedly happened at Bobby Mackey's? Where they...
Oh, that is. Yeah, that's exactly it. Bobby Mackey's, is it Music World?
Yeah.
That's it. It's in Newport.
Okay.
And it's allegedly haunted by Alonzo Walling. I mentioned that Scott Jackson had a slow-witted roommate. Well, that was him.
Ah.
So apparently, so the story goes, he haunts where Bobby Mackey's Music World is now located.
Oh,
because
really?
he was hanged on that spot, I think, is how it goes.
Huh.
They dumped her body down the well there or something strange like that. I can't
Well,
remember.
they actually left her body out in the open. It was found almost immediately, but the head was never found.
Well, it's easier to transport a head than a body, so...
Well, it still is Kentucky. Now, you had a section in here called Circus Trouble, where it's different, I guess, areas and different years. You have a whole bunch of different circus stories. Won't you tell us some about the circus stories and things that took place with those?
Well, that's another case where I really had no plan at all. I'd just go through all the old newspapers, and I noticed a pattern, which was that, boy, people were violent at circuses back in the old days.
Clowns.
So I just kept collecting all these stories about fights and murders and other things taking place at circuses. And enough of them happened in Kentucky that I thought, well, there's a chapter right there. So there are stories about townspeople getting beaten with tent pegs, and stories about people attacking circus workers. There's a story or two maybe about train wrecks, circus train wrecks, including one where a tiger got out.
Wow.
And that took place in Garrett County, which what makes that very interesting to me personally. It occurred at a place called Moran Summit. And I teach at EKU, and I used to teach at the Danville Extension Center, and the road that I took to get from Danville back to my house, I think, was almost exactly the route where the train went. Because I would pass right by this place called Moran Hills Summit. And it really wasn't until I wrote the book that I said, hey, I think this train wreck, this circus train wreck, happened right where I used to go driving home.
Ooh.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I guess the circuses back then were pretty tough. And most of probably the carny people or the circus people were had a history, as it were.
They were very clannish. They didn't like anybody, the towns, these are their paying customers. But if townspeople showed up and got sarcastic with them or tried to sneak in or tried to peep at the dancing girls or anything, they'd get attacked, just like running into a swarm of bees by these circus workers. It's amazing how many of the stories involve tent pegs. I guess they just make good handy weapons and pull one out of the ground and run with it.
Ouch, murder by death peg? That would hurt.
No, it happened.
Oh,
And you had one that was eaten by a lion or something like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, let me try and find that one.
I was trying to remember which one it was because I didn't write it down.
Oh, here we are. Olive Hill, Carter County, Kentucky, 1915.
Right.
The audience got an unexpected thrill for their shiny new nickels when Frank White, the lion tamer, encountered a big cat that refused to go along with the act. When the performers, note the subtlety here, when other performers removed White from the cage, he was a head shorter than when he entered.
Yeah.
Which was my roundabout way of saying that the lion took his hat off.
That was funny. Yeah, you got a whole bunch of little short excerpts like that, different things about the circus, which is funny. People doesn't realize that Kentucky back in 1800s, I would say, between 1800 and 1890, was pretty much, you didn't go into territories that you didn't know because you may not come back out.
That's very true. Deep suspicion of strangers. There was one or two stories where townspeople attacked the circus rather than the other way around because they just didn't like having the strangers showing up.
Right. You did. I know my folks come from, let's see, it was Manchester, Kentucky. Actually, my grandpa and grandma on my dad's side come from Manchester, and my mom and come from just a little south of that. Matter of fact, they lived on a little place off of 421 called Rocky Branch Road. And I forget what, I would assume that it's still probably the same county as Manchester. It could be a little south of that. But, yeah, there was all kinds of things. I mean, you had feuds. I guess my grandpa supposedly got killed in a logging accident where they had logs stacked up on the side of a hill and it broke loose and rolled down over him. That was the main story, but I've heard roundabout tales since then where he had, I guess his skull had been caved in, like he'd been hit with something, and they think that his brother did it. That's the stories that I've heard. But you get a lot of killings like that where they would never have anybody found or caught over that.
That's true. That happened a lot in Eastern Kentucky especially. And yeah, Manchester was very famous for its feuds for a long, long time. Those continued all the way up to like the 1930s and 40s.
That's Clay County, Kentucky. Yeah. Well, I still have. Matter of fact, my dad told me one time, if I go down there, don't tell people that your last name's Foister.
Well, even now.
Oh yeah, even now. I would assume. I mean, I haven't been back down in there for a long time, but I've had relation that lived down in London and over in Manchester, and more than once they've been shot at or shot at somebody. So
I'm really familiar with the London, Manchester area.
Yeah. So my I had an uncle. I guess he lives in London now, but they lived in Manchester for a long time. And his last name was Foister. In World War II, I forget how many times he was wounded and the medals he got. I would assume that the last time he was in the Battle of the Remagen Bridge. And I guess he saved some of his comrades, got them off a hill. And at another point in the battle, he was either shot or hand grenade or something in his head. And he could go kind of crazy sometimes.
I would think if you got hand grenaded in the head, that would sort of make you go around the bend a bit.
Well, you get fragments. I mean, but I think he was shot instead of a hand grenade. But yeah, he got all kinds of ribbons and medals and stuff for it.
President.
But there's times when even him, after he come back home, there's a lot of moonshine going on, and he'd been shot at a few times. So I don't go down there and tell people who I am, put it that way.
Wow.
But it's an interesting area. I mean,
Yeah.
You get off
They hold a grudge, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, and you get off the main road. It's very easy to get like places you shouldn't be.
Well, they can also be very friendly, though.
Well, they can be.
Just if you're a certain person from a certain family, you might get in trouble. But if you're anyone else, they'll be pretty friendly.
Right. Pretty
There's a
interesting.
story in the book, too, about a Clay County feud that just involved a number of shootings.
Oh, yeah.
So is it kind of like a Hatfield-McCoy thing?
It was, only it would involve not just two families, but several.
Oh.
Because families would side with other families.
Right. And you'd be surprised that a lot of the feuds come from water rights or I would say, what else was it they fought for? Salt?
Salt.
Yeah.
Coal. Rights to coal land.
Right. Coal.
And shining.
Yeah. And I know you, in your part with Clay County, because you had some stories in there about Clay County, and one of them I thought was real interesting. There was a family that lived there, and it's called I would say TV Sheets, and that's on page 79.
Oh, right. It was there's a cemetery. It's on the Clay County, Jackson County border. And it's hard enough to find that it took me forever to find it, even with directions. But if you go there, it's the Wilson Cemetery, and there's this big, long line of tombstones from one family, the Shepherd family. and they all died within something like 10 or 12 years of each other, which would be astronomical odds. But the story that I was given was that they all died of tuberculosis, one after the other, and that finally the health authorities burned down the house, furniture and all.
Hopefully with no one inside it.
Oh, no one inside. But that was the story I was told. I wasn't able to confirm the house burning. And unfortunately, there weren't very good death certificates at the time. So out of all this big long line of 8 or 9 or 10 people, I could only find death certificates on 2 of them. But the 2 that I did find definitely did say tuberculosis.
Well, it would have been a very smart move on their part to burn down.
And do you remember what year that was?
They would have died through the 1920s and early 1930s. And then a couple lived as long as 1941, 43, 47. So from about 1922 to 47, 25 years. But still, that would be...
And how many family members was it that died?
Well, let me do a quick count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Looks like 9. 9 within 25 years, which would still be quite a high number.
All from the same thing.
At least they weren't.
And
at least they weren't all
pretty young too.
All right, Jeff, go ahead.
I was just making. I'm good. It's a good thing they weren't all shipped off to Waverly.
Oh, right.
I don't know.
I kind of wonder why they weren't, actually.
Yeah, because I was usually like, oh, you're out of here.
Well, they didn't live too long, though, once they caught it, did they?
Yeah, but it's more a case of getting them away from the healthy people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean the family themselves didn't know what was really going on, I guess. Or once they caught it, they didn't last very long. They may not.
But yeah, I mean, you kind of have to wonder. After a certain point, you think they'd realize something very unhealthy was going on in that house. A couple of them lived to be old, up till the 1960s and 70s, but only 2 out of a family of like 12 or 13 people.
That's high. So what is the creepiness in the title, Clay County Creepiness?
Well, there's the one story about the family that apparently was wiped out by TB, and there's a true crime story, and there's a feud story.
Oh yeah, that was about I don't know, 8, 9 pages, 10 pages.
Well, it was the feud story was only a couple pages, but it only covers a very, very tiny slice of the violent history of Clay County. It was so violent that at one time in the 30s, the Kentucky legislature actually thought of abolishing the whole county, of cutting it up and joining it to other counties, which they never did, but the place was violent enough that they thought of doing that.
Or just fence it around, put a fence around it and make them stay in there. Yeah.
Stay there and don't let anyone out.
Wow. I assume that the sheriff was kind of ineffective, if there was one.
Well,
probably I wouldn't want to have been the sheriff back then.
I'm sure that the sheriff was probably on the take also at times.
Well, it was a problem. I don't know if it was a problem there specifically, but in a lot of places, if you made it worth the sheriff's while, they would look the other way.
Well, in Manchester, it had to do a lot with moonshine and stuff like that. So I'm sure that's what a lot of that was.
Well, I'm sure there were mobsters down there too at some point, right?
Probably so.
There would have had to have been, I would assume with the moonshine and prohibition, that somebody was making money off of it somewhere.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Had no idea that it was so lucrative, and probably still is in a lot of places.
Well,
Yeah, some of it still goes on.
Wow.
like I said, my grandpa and them lived in Manchester, and the way that our family got to Ohio was my grandpa got word that the revenuers were after him because they did moonshine also. And he snuck away from the area and caught a freight train up to Ohio and sent for the rest of the family. That was how he got out of it. But yeah, the law was looking for them too.
Wow.
And that was the grandpa on my dad's side, not my mom's. So, yeah.
Interesting. And I don't see a lot of railroad stories at some point. Do you think, or is there enough on, say, the hobos and the rail hitchhikers that would make for colorful stories?
I don't
see
really
any.
have too many hobo or tramp. There's one in this book, the Some Mother Son story. There may be others. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. But if I go through all my old files that I've been keeping all these years, I'm sure I do have more.
Kind of wondering whether or not the fringe population ever made it into the newspapers, or whether it was just considered a non-news story. Or back then, was everything considered printable?
Well, there were, as far as tramps go, there were thousands of them at the time. There's a book by Otto Bettman. It was written in the early 70s called The Good Old Days. They were terrible. And it talks all about the horrible pollution and overpopulation and crime of the era that we like to consider the good old days. And there was one chapter on how many tramps there were, out of work, men traveling around America, thousands and thousands of them.
Well, the thing about down in Kentucky, you had a lot of poor people. I mean, they might have a little land that they had to work just so they could have their own food and stuff like that. But they did a lot of coal mining, and I lost, I don't know, 2 or 3 different relatives in the coal mines. So I know all about that too. That was hard work, and the pay wasn't really all that good, but every little bit they could get would help them make it through the winter or the year. And a lot of them is real poor down there, and I don't think that they had back then. They wasn't getting anything from the government other than just whatever they could work for, whether it was doing laundry for somebody or raising crops. That's about all they could do.
Yeah, that was very true up till about the 1940s, I would say.
Yeah, really. Yeah, there's quite a interesting stories around there as far as coal mines too, because I'm sure there were, every time you go into the mine, there were mine collapses, explosions, etc.
Yeah, I've found a lot of articles on mining accidents, which so far I haven't found anything to do with them, but who knows, I may find a way of using them.
I guess at some point it was just considered a way of life and part of the cost to pay to do the job. But I'm sure that there's probably some interesting stories among the miners. I mean, at least in the West Coast, there's the Tommy knockers, which are mine gremlins, if nothing else. There's a whole group of superstitions that miners have, and probably other groups do too. I'm sure that even probably the moonshiners had their own superstitions, right?
I don't know of any specifically, but I bet they did.
All right, it's just about time for us to take a quick break.
Great.
So what we'll do is, if anybody has questions about the book or questions at all for Kevin, send them to us. You can private chat me, H. Foister, or Ceiling Cat, and we will get those answered when we come back from break. Till then, I'd say probably about 5 minutes or so of we will be back. I'll let remember you, Mike will be live, so I'll let Barbara. Who's taking us out, Barbara or Jeff?
I'm
Jeff
still
does
here.
that.
Jeff's
If,
taking
if
us out.
Skype actually holds on though for the few moments, you're listening to the Paranormal View on para-x.com with your hosts Henry Foister, Ceiling Cat Barbara Duncan, and myself Jeffrey Gould, with tonight's returning guest author Keven McQueen. So stay tuned for more of the Paranormal View after the break.